Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner. I'm your host, Trey Walsh, and today we have on the show Ahmed Gatnash. Now, Ahmed is the executive director of the Kawaakibi Foundation, which focuses on human rights in North Africa and the Middle East region. And he's also the author, along with Iyad, of this book right here I have for those watching on YouTube, The Middle East Crisis Factory, which is such a fantastic book focusing on the modern history of the Middle East, on politics in the Middle East for those that are just looking at situations and conflicts in the Middle East, such as myself, like from a Western point of view, and just not knowing where to think or turn in terms of just understanding the basics of this region and the complexities in the region as well. So written from two authors that have deep ties to this region and family and history with this region, and getting their perspective was absolutely fantastic. In terms of this conversation, Ahmed is really fluent in all sorts of human rights issues and democracies and forms of governments and what he likes to focus and talk on. So this conversation covered a range of topics, including Western democracies and in terms of conflicts in the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, and even talks about Bitcoin and how Bitcoin can be a force for good and for human rights, still in this early stage of experimentation, and what will Bitcoin look like in the future, and what could it be used for in terms of a tool for human rights and things like that. So really hope you all enjoy this conversation. As always, you can reach out to me with any thoughts or questions on this conversation. You can reach out to me at hello@progressivebitcoiner.com. And as always, be sure to check out our promo links to Bitbox and SAS Mining to take advantages of those discount codes below. And please also subscribe to our Substack newsletter, where you can get issues of our newsletter, our weekly newsletter, delivered right to your inbox that covers different events from Bitcoin and the landscape of Bitcoin globally. And we kind of handpick certain stories to talk about from a progressive lens and focus on progressive values. So that'll be delivered weekly to your inbox, as well as episodes of our podcast delivered to your inbox as well, in an easily shareable format as well. If you have a certain episode that you like and you want to share with family or friends, that's an easy way for you to do that as well. So be sure to check that out in the show notes. The Substack link is in the show notes. All right, thank you for listening, and thank you for sharing this episode and any others, and for all of your support. And we'll see you again next week. Hi, Ahmed, and welcome to the Progressive Bitcoiner. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. And thanks for having me. How are you?
Absolutely. Doing well. I was just saying before we jumped on, I like these morning conversations, get to have coffee on the interview at the start of the day, talking with you. So really looking forward to this one. Now, people listening to this show, as I was mentioning, might have heard your conversation with Peter about a year ago, might have heard different talks or kind of met you maybe in person at different conferences and things like that. And the work and different things you've done with like the Human Rights Foundation, Oslo Freedom Forum. But for those that haven't, do you want to give a little intro to who you are and what you do?
So I'm a Libyan British activist. I started an organization called Kawaakibi Foundation, which is a human rights organization focused on the long-term prospects of freedom in the Middle East and North Africa specifically. And we try to take unconventional approaches and work on things which are potentially revolutionary in the long term, but are under-resourced or receiving disproportionately less attention than they merit in the present moment.
Awesome. Yeah, and also I'll be sure to hold up your book and plug it here too. Middle East Crisis Factory. I will say I read this on my morning commutes as well to my nonprofit gig on the train, and I think people have seen the cover and they're like, what is that about? I've gotten some looks on the train. It's a fantastic book. I know you poured, as you described to me, poured a lot of yourself into this. And I'm going to put this in the show notes and really highly recommend people look at it as just a good way for, especially I think folks in the West or folks who feel so detached, and as we were saying, feel that it's too complicated to possibly understand or try to get into, just Middle East history, politics, or regime change, all of these different things. I feel like is a really good intro and understanding from two folks that know more than we do about these situations, whether it's family connections, different personal situations from both of you who wrote the book. Can you tell people a little bit about your reason for writing the book and getting into it?
So I think as a lot of people's experiences looking at the way the Middle East is, you're almost gaslit by constantly being told the region is too complex to understand, and there are reasons way beyond your comprehension that things have to be this way. But if you allow yourself to actually think about it for yourself for a moment, it becomes incredibly clear to anyone that the way especially Western nations have behaved towards the region over the past few decades is incredibly counterproductive, if not completely insane. And we wanted to take a first principles look, allowing ourselves to go beyond the political orthodoxies about the way policy must be and actually understand, why is this region the way it is? How did it get here? And what does it actually need in order to, heal from the gaping wounds that it's suffering?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
the book is like two halves. The first half is pretty much a historical primer. We're talking about the last century of Middle East history and how we got to this position, with kind of case studies illustrating a phenomenon we call the vicious triangle, which is basically terrorism, tyranny, and foreign intervention, and how these three forces mutually reinforce, and how policy over the last half century or so has basically consisted of attempting to use one of these against the other two, and kind of taking short vignettes from different countries in the region to illustrate how in every situation in which this has been tried, it's actually ended up backfiring and empowering the very thing you're trying to destroy. And then the second half of the book is looking forward and trying to explain from those values and those principles that we articulated what actually can be done that would be more productive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so many good things in this book, and it's not a giant book or anything that's too and no one needs a primer or precursor to the book. I'd say if you have an in-depth knowledge of the region and you've studied it, it's still a great book for you. But if you have no idea what is going on other than what we've been told, whether it's in the U.S. or in your context, it's also a great book. So really going to encourage people to get this and read it. You sent over, and we went back and forth on a bunch of topics for the show, because we're talking about Middle East, North Africa, all of these different things. Obviously, you're focused on human rights. The hope and thought of Bitcoin for resistance. All of these different topics. I was just describing to you. This is a whole seminar. It's overwhelming to think about what to talk about. That is. But I love some of the topics you sent over, including kind of like institution building and the need for new progressive paradigms. Because I think one thing that you've probably been digging even deeper into since the book, because the book presents different paradigms that, just as you described, we're not necessarily used to, right? Like in the US, there's a left approach and a right approach to foreign policy, sometimes in different mini camps within that. In other nations, the same thing. And I think you try to weed through that to see directly what would possibly help the best in a situation, or how can we look forward out of these paradigms. So for you, when you sent that over, when you think about institutional building and different new progressive paradigms, what does that mean to you, to kind of prime this conversation?
So this was a big debate that was happening in the Middle East region early in the Arab Spring in the first couple of years after 2011. The whole question was, like, we're overthrowing these regimes, what comes next? And obviously some people approached that from a very identitarian side and wanted to, return to an idealized past and bring in systems of governance from history. Other people of the kind of more secular liberal persuasion wanted to import systems of governance from, countries where it's perceived to be broadly working out. Like, I'm talking about Western democracy, if it's possible to boil it down to two words, which I don't believe it is. And our contention at the time was basically the system which is being called Western democracy is not really having a great track record at home. Like, you have massive inequality, economic inequality, continually spiraling. That inequality is starting to affect the political process because of the involvement of money in politics. The media is kind of captured by an elite. The population feels generally less represented across Western democracies, has less faith and less trust in its institutions, especially the political institutions, but also the media. And the whole idea was, why would we want to copy a system with its assumptions, with its flaws, and many of those assumptions being made at the time that the system was built? So like talking about the US, you guys happen to have pretty much like the train of thought of the founding fathers, that they made certain decisions because of certain reasons. Like you can see that those arguments in stuff like the Federalist Papers. Why is the Constitution this way? Because of this. And after 200 or 300 years, when society has changed so much, when technology has had such a massive impact on society, some of those assumptions aren't entirely correct anymore. So again, like why import a system with assumptions that are outdated when you can rebuild something which is suited to the present day and which addresses the flaws and the gaping cracks which have started to emerge.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, that's basically where it all came from. And then around that, you also need new institutions, again, because of the way society is evolving, because of the way communities are changing, the way people relate to each other. Society is atomized, and you have record low levels of trust in like pretty much every institution you can think of, from the media to politics to local government. People feel disconnected and don't relate anymore. So what can you build that brings them together again?
Yeah, and where do you start with thinking through these things, right? Is this a theoretical exercise? Is this a let's attempt this locally in different nations? Obviously, you're talking about many different things here. You're talking about, okay, the Western world in the U.S., their kind of thought was always importing democracy, especially in the Iraq War. Okay, we're going to import democracy and let the Iraqis handle this, right? We're going to demolish what they knew, and then they're going to build democracy, and it's going to look just like ours. And we're going to be there, and then everything's going to be great. And then under the Obama administration, well, this is more Afghanistan, but different thoughts of like, it will take X number of years, and then we'll pull out at this exact moment, and it'll be perfect, right? So there's that. And then there's the context of what you're describing actually from the ground up in different contexts of different nation states in the Middle East and what that looks like for each, state and network state. So for you, where does one begin with this? Whether it's, describe to me, I think, help me break down a little bit of what your organization would do in terms of this, like your nonprofit would do, thinking from an activist lens when having these type of conversations. Like, what would be some of the steps that your organization would take to bring about the world you're describing?
So it's obviously way too big a task for a single organization, and I think all any of us can do is pick off small pieces that are feasible and build it piece by piece from the bottom up. The approach we're taking, and there are many different completely valid approaches. Our one happens to be that we're picking radical concepts and technologies and trying to bring them into the mainstream. So that includes a financial system which is not completely centralized and controlled by political powers, which is obviously where our interest in Bitcoin comes from, because one of the core issues of the region, you mentioned, you alluded to the central incoherence of the whole democracy civilizing mission in the region, which is like democracy is meant to be having agency over your own future, but that idea is being brought to you at the barrel of a gun, so you're not actually having agency of your own future. But if you actually approach it from the perspective of how do you increase the agency of the population and give them more and more control over their own destiny and reduce the extent to which centralized powers which are unrepresentative, can impose their will on them, and you start looking through the root causes of that unaccountability of power, one of them is inevitably going to be economic centralization. So Bitcoin is going to play a role in that. One of them is going to be unrepresentative political systems, and this is a discussion that's happening around the world. Like even in Western democracies, we're having discussions about concepts like proportional representation, and whether having a bipartisan political system in which you're locked into one of two binary choices is really functional in the modern world. We're talking about the relationship between economic inequality and political inequality, and what measures can be taken to keep money out of politics. We're talking about, especially this one's happening more in the West at the moment, the role the media plays in all of this, and whether new media institutions can play a role in leveling the playing field. We're living through at the moment an unprecedented, probably since the time of the invention of the printing press, decentralization of the media. Now that people can have, their own newsletters and podcasts and independent media outlets, people are no longer locked into the same 2 or 3 outlets which tell you what the person who owns the outlet wants you to hear. Yeah. Now you can kind of approach your own menu, and it's that kind of creativity coupled with systematic thinking that I think everyone who aspires to change needs to pursue. And again, like, you can only ever, as an individual or even an organization, tackle some small pieces of it. But if we work together as a movement and work, unfailingly for a generation, maybe we'll get somewhere.
This episode of The Progressive Bitcoiner is brought to you by Zeus. Zeus is a self-custodial Bitcoin wallet for Android and iOS. The app features a built-in Lightning node that allows you to take full control of how you make payments on-chain and on Lightning. You can easily onboard to the Lightning network and let Zeus's Lightning service provider, Olympus, do all the heavy lifting for you. Or you can get more hands-on and curate your own Lightning channels with whoever you transact with most. Zeus has best-in-class privacy and allows you to have great peace of mind when sending and receiving Lightning payments. Not only does the Zeus team not want to know how you're using your money, but they're building things in a way that they can't know. There's also a first-of-its-kind Lightning address that will allow you to receive payments 24/7 to your mobile wallet self-custodially. This is a great solution for a range of people. For those who just want to have the technical ability to set up their own infrastructure, to nomads and dissidents that need to accept donations on the move. Other Lightning wallets don't give the users this level of control. In fact, many of them operate more like bank accounts that can be revoked and ultimately lead to you losing your money. With Zeus, you're in full control of your private keys and therefore can start to take full control of your financial destiny. To learn more and to learn where to download, head to ZeusLN.com. Yeah, you mentioned journalism. I think one thing that's always interesting to me too, and I think this could be possible anywhere, but especially what you see in the West is, you've seen the rise of what people call as independent media, independent journalism, which is great on the surface, right? And I really do believe in that, a decentralization of kind of what the printing press did for the masses, right? In terms of, let's say, a religious component, where it used to be one person speaking the truth, and then people were able to print and read and disseminate different information and read a holy text for themselves. Okay, see what this did throughout society. Like, it's not just one person that we have to trust and believe in. You can see for yourself, analyze for yourself. But then you see quote unquote independent journalists get really, really, really big, to where they have millions and millions and millions of subscribers and followers. They're eclipsing traditional media, in the US, kind of the political behemoths, MSNBC, CNN, things like this, in terms of numbers and views. And these people will still pretend to be, the little folks, the victims, this and that, when it's kind of completely flipped. Like Joe Rogan's a good example in the United States. And I'm net neutral on Joe Rogan, and this isn't he's just one example. There's many others. Tucker Carlson doing similar things on X and things like this. So these are behemoth media companies at this point. So I'm just curious your thoughts on this. When analyzing any of these systems, it's kind of, I view this way in politics as well. There could be someone who's a really grassroots activist that gets into a political position, and then years go by, and you're like, what changed? Like, they're different. They're, for lack of better words, co-opted. They're a part of the system now. How do we? Because for me, I always have a tough time of understanding how do we prevent that from happening. Right? Could be the same. Take any nation state. It could be a Middle Eastern nation state. Anything where a grassroots activist, and then let's say they become president, and then that is all gone away, died away. I'm not saying it has to happen that way, but that typically is the trend that we've seen with power. Power corrupts. So for me, that's a struggle for me to think about, I think.
Yeah, well, I think like pointing to the danger of setting up sacred cows in any context, and the need to always be critical. I think this is, again, maybe not popular to say in this day and age. One of the things that the US got extremely right 250 odd years ago is the concept of checks and balances, and being really rigorous in figuring out how they can be applied to a system, understanding the incentives at play and how to control them. because a lot of the time on the left, we do kind of entirely put our trust in independent media or in specific influencers, and leaving our critical thinking at the door after that, which can take us down, dark paths. When instead we should be, a modern version of that check on power would be working on media literacy and making sure people can apply critical thinking to the stuff they're consuming, even when it's material that confirms their biases, and understanding that we have biases, and how to go about checking that as you consume media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things too you just mentioned, us on the left. This podcast is kind of targeting a left audience, progressives, to talk about Bitcoin, talk about so many different topics that are adjacent to this. When you look at, because again, in the Bitcoin community in the United States, it's still largely right leaning, largely U.S. based libertarian. Some folks will even say, what do you mean left or progressive in Bitcoin? It doesn't make sense. It's separating all of that, right? Just talking with us, talking to our audience of folks. A lot of folks in the left, I'm just trying to see where things have shifted throughout the ages, post COVID, post for the US, kind of Bernie Sanders movement. Even before that, I've had a lot of friends. This happens on two different extremes, right? But let's say when analyzing something like the Middle East, I think one thing your book does really well is even a random example of, this wasn't necessarily like a progressive or left, but the Iran nuclear deal under Obama, right? The politicization of that incident, right? It's like, okay, if you're in this camp, you have to fully unilaterally support this, right? And then you describe kind of the human rights abuses and things that were potentially allowed. Okay, on the other side, a Trump approach at the time, completely remove it. Let's create just cataclysmic, just we don't know what's going to happen, like two fringe examples. Chaos, exactly, that's the best word for it. Two fringe examples, right? When you look at left movements in the West and their approach to, and I hate even saying this because you have to localize it, but Middle Eastern affairs or Middle East and North African affairs, the left has typically taken different approaches. Again, even in Israel-Palestine, right? Taken specific approaches on things without maybe understanding what's going on. Some folks will do this because their favorite political leader has said so, or because their friends have said so, or because the movement dictates it. So when looking at that, have you seen, has that shift been as apparent to you as it is to me, maybe even in your context in Europe, similar to the context in the US, in terms of how the left has approached these different affairs and been caught up in things without trying to take a look at understanding what's going on, or trying to see, actually, this would be more helpful rather than that? Because I can criticize the right all day on these things, and I do. But I think, too, part of me is like, okay, talking to this progressive and left audience, having someone like yourself on, having these type of conversations is really healthy and good.
Yeah, so it is really easy to criticize the right. It's very transparent what they do. A lot of the time, it's about naked political and economic interest. But many left-wing perspectives on foreign policy in the region have been way to the other extreme and with the opposite failure mode. And Obama is actually a really good example of this, because in his desire to disengage militarily and end the forever wars, he basically went to the opposite extreme of saying, oh, these Arabs, this is their culture. They're going to fight each other and kill each other forever. And, having dictatorship as part of their culture, having sectarian warfare as part of their culture. That was the basic undertone of his position on the region. And I think a couple of times he pretty much said it explicitly. The bigotry of low expectations. And his entire policy was basically based around, let's find some friendly dictators who want too out there for our taste, who we can do deals with and who we can trust to keep this region quote unquote stable under a military boot. And then we can just look away and we don't have to pay too much attention to the horrific cost of that on the ground. Sometimes on the so that's kind of like a center left. On the more left perspective, you often get this idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And because we're against empire and neocolonialism, anyone else who claims to be against that is therefore on our side. And therefore they can fall into the mistake of legitimizing awful groups and movements with this, misguided idea that these people are anti-colonial and therefore they're the good guys. And again, you're kind of making this assumption that these people are the legitimate representatives of those that they rule, and therefore they deserve to be supported, even when the people on the ground are crying out to be, protected from the suffering they're experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, everything you just said there refutes so much of what I see in daily life, whether it's from that left group that I think is more maybe intellectually involved or wants to do what you just said, like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or you have this kind of center left, moderate left, a conservative left in a way of it's weird. It's like you turn on warmongering in one moment and then extremely isolationist and shut down in another, which just creates more instability, as you said here and as is described in your book as well. Now, one thing that I want to focus on as well, because we haven't in the pod yet, and just in having conversations with people, I think pulling on that thread of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and seeing that's a large part of like our podcast. It's the Progressive Bitcoiner. There are a million different ways to be progressive, but I think a lot of group of my friends, kind of this podcast, different folks that are in Bitcoin and use that term progressive or left. We're not necessarily like democratic people or the Democratic Party. A lot of us are disengaged with politics in general, but I think a lot of us are a part of historic left movements, whether it's Occupy, whether it's different type movements like that, like Black Lives Matter, different movements and groups that I really do believe in and have believed in, different climate movements, things like this. But in talking with that audience about it's hard for me to put into words, because I feel like from my observation, and you'd have probably a similar observation, but also a deeper understanding of the region and the work you're doing. This situation with Israel and Palestine has been one that's really, really interesting to follow. What I've seen from a Western perspective is when people are looking at the situation, we look completely through that Western lens. And the only way that we identify, or people in my age range or from the left, we think of the Iraq War, and we think of Al Qaeda and what happened in Iraq and the horrible abuses that the United States did in Iraq. That's the lens that a lot of folks have been looking at this situation through this. Can you talk about maybe the obvious mistake of doing that? 'Cause this is just such a particular situation that I've been really perplexed by the movement on. There's obviously a lot of anti-Semitism, but at the same time, there's horrible human rights abuses happening in Gaza from my perspective. So there's a lot of extreme actions and things happening throughout this conflict, obviously on the ground, but with movements that are swelling throughout the West and throughout the world.
So I'll step back from Gaza for just a second and we'll come back, because something you said was really important. It's that almost like a trauma on the left from what happened in Iraq, which was obviously, one of the greatest crimes committed in this century. Mm-hmm. And that experience of seeing a war of aggression being perpetrated by Western democracies against the general will of their populations kind of entrenched this principle that all intervention is terrible. And mm-hmm. that is now like the knee-jerk reaction without actually thinking about it. So I'm from Libya. Early in the Arab Spring in 2011, people rose up for their dignity and their freedom. And Gaddafi's response was basically, we're going to go from street to street, door to door, and wipe people out. Mm-hmm. There was a column of tanks on the outskirts of Benghazi, which is the second city of the country, on the night the NATO no-fly zone was implemented. And I have no doubt that if the no-fly zone hadn't been implemented, and if those tanks hadn't also been bombed by Western fighter jets that night, there would have been a massacre that following day on the mm-hmm. scale of things we've witnessed in Gaza or in Syria. Mm-hmm. And the West made that catastrophic, the left and left movements in the West made the catastrophic error of judgment at the time that intervention should not happen. And we saw the consequence of that later in Syria, because intervention didn't happen in Syria. And now you compare the death toll in the two countries. It's still not great in Libya, but it's in the 20 to 30,000 range. Whereas in Syria, the United Nations stopped counting after 500,000. And, it's credibly assumed to be well above 1 million people dead, and several million displaced externally and internally now. So it's not so simple to, take a single principle like that and universalize it. Every situation has to be judged on its merits. And that's the real disaster. That policy has become about tribalism, and it's what does my side support so I can support it, rather than what's the right thing to do in this situation. Coming back to what's happening in Gaza right now, it's another example, I think, of the need for new institutions, because what we see generally is, like public opinion in the US is against what's happening in Gaza. It's against giving more arms to Israel to continue massacring civilians at an unheard of scale. And yet, if you look at the political system, and if you look at most of the mainstream media, you would not get that impression. Because there's pretty much bipartisan support, and the dissenting view is excluded from policy entirely. It speaks to the fact that these political institutions have been engineered to keep dissenting voices outside of the room, even when the dissenting voices are the majority. And again, that bipartisan system is now no longer a force for stability, because it's keeping, like, the pressure valve has flipped, and now pressure is building up because people are actually angry at the system for not representing them.
Right. Yeah, I've never seen a bigger divide in my lifetime on public opinion. Even Iraq War initially obviously wasn't, but a couple of years after started to be. But I mean, in the quote unquote Democratic Party, however they do these polls, it's upwards of 70, 80% opposition to any arms deals, any kind of continuing of conflict in Gaza, and calling for a ceasefire. I think that was one of the specific questions. On the right, it's lower, but I want to say it's still in the 30s, 40s or something like that. But nationally, an average is close to 70%, right? And then U.S. foreign policy, you're right. It almost lives completely out of the political process. It's its own nation state. It's its own fundamental.
It's the same in Western Europe as well.
Yeah,
I think public opinion in Germany is in a fairly similar place, and German policy is similarly ideologically pro-Israel, like pathologically. They're unable to evaluate the situation on its merits because of their history.
Sure. Yep. Completely. How do we avoid it? It's literally like a seesaw of one extreme to another, right? I mean, we see this in political elections, right? It's just the natural swing of things, whether it's on different, foreign policy, domestic policy, things like that. You see this pendulum swing back and forth. How do we get to a place of stability? How do we get to a place of actually moving the needle forward on, we don't have to say that specific instance, but on any of these issues?
Yeah, I think that comes back to the need for new institutions. So you were talking about a few minutes ago the Democratic Party. I don't know if you consider yourself politically homeless, or if you consider
I do.
yourself
So I think I've said it here before. I'm technically, what's known as a registered independent here in the U.S. So the thing that strips me from personally is I'm not able to vote in primaries because of that. But a while ago, I became extremely disconnected from the Democratic Party. I think post Bernie Sanders, post Hillary Clinton, what that election did against overwhelming support and kind of outcries from supporters, and then we got a Trump presidency, and they're still continuing to do that to this day. And I'm like, I feel confident in my decision. So yes, feel very politically homeless. I think a lot of people that are listening to a Bitcoin podcast or in Bitcoin, obviously you see something wrong with the system. So I think in a lot of ways, many people that are progressive Bitcoiners, in Bitcoin in general, I think they feel politically homeless. Yeah.
And what I always tell American friends is, like, if you want to help fix what's going on in the Middle East, the best way of doing that is to actually make your own political system more representative, so that it's accountable, and so that you can't have this massive disconnect in which people who have no skin in the game can carry out wars of aggression or support terrible policy. You mentioned a few movements as well, like, Black Lives Matter, and I don't know if you mentioned Occupy Wall Street, but there are a bunch of those kind of left counterculture movements. I'd say that whilst they show an incredibly clear desire for an alternative, they're also under-institutionalized for a number of reasons. Like, you can obviously see the difference between an amorphous movement like Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter and an institutionalized movement like the Democratic Party, or like on the right, like the Tea Party within the Republican Party. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but that's one of the core things that needs to change. There are lots of kind of systems underpinning the non-accountableness of the political system and its non-representativeness. There are things like the fact that electoral districts are gerrymandered in order to keep votes a certain way. The fact that the political system encourages coalescence into two parties. This has also become really clear in the UK, because we have Conservatives and Labour, and then a bunch of smaller parties which are kept out by the fact that it's a first past the post system. But even when you look within the Conservatives and within Labour, which for the last 5+ years have basically both been in a state of perpetual chaos, part of the reason for that is neither of them is actually a single party. They're both multiple parties awkwardly coexisting under a single umbrella. So within Labour, you have like a centrist movement from like the legacy of Tony Blair, and you have a much more hard right movement, which is what brought Corbyn to power within the party a few years ago. And they don't really work within the same party. They don't actually agree on very much. And again, with the Conservatives, you have the same thing. You have centrist David Cameron-esque Conservatives. You have a much further right Boris Johnson type movement who don't agree on very much. Brexit exposed many of the fault lines between them. But the only reason they're in this awkward marriage together is because the political system is set up in such a way that it only really works if you're a member of the two main parties. And that's the thing that I think anyone who wants, I wouldn't even just say progressive movements, anyone who wants politics to work better and to be less tribal needs to be working on ways to fix that over the next decade.
Hi everyone, hope you're enjoying the episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Bitbox. Now, Bitbox is a hardware wallet that's open source, incredibly secure and easy to use, and it's what I'm using to safely secure my Bitcoin in cold storage. Now, I know self-custodying Bitcoin can really be intimidating, but Bitbox is designed for ease of use without compromising on security. It's USB-C compatible and allows you to easily back up and restore your private keys with a micro SD card, which is really cool. Now, you can purchase the Bitbox using the promo code TPB at the link found in the show notes for 5% off your purchase. And I really want to thank Bitbox for their support of the podcast, and I'm really excited about this new partnership. All right, I'll let you get back to the episode now. Yeah, and I think the way I kind of approach some of these things or look at it is it really takes that coalition building, for lack of better terms. Like everyone plays a role, right? You have a political insider who might need to propose certain legislation that gets the ball rolling. You need political outsiders to this. You need different ragtag movements who say, I would never touch foot inside this building or speak with those people. You need some of the people that are willing to go and speak with politicians that are also from this group. So taking all of those groups together, for me personally in the US context, I feel like that's one of the only ways to, but you're right. I think talking about Occupy and Black Lives Matter, there was not enough of and I felt this about climate movements, especially because I've gotten to the point more and more frustrated with these movements, but also more so just folks wanting to educate themselves. Like, are we after solutions and actually to make this change? Are we after you excited that you're a part of a movement and that's what you're doing, right? I think I'm more on the solution side, which led me to Bitcoin in the first place. From a human rights angle, from a view of the system, I'm like, I don't see long-term how this system can be better for property rights for individual, for human rights, and for wealth inequality on a long enough time horizon without a new system that led me to Bitcoin in the first place. If I didn't connect that, I probably wouldn't be here. I'd be like, I'm not into finance, I'm not into money. What is this about? Like, I'm this
Yeah.
like liberal nonprofit guy. Like, so for me, it's like coalition building and trying to get people all on the same page with that. I don't
And
know.
again, if you take it from first principles and you want to be more radical about the way the paradigm currently works, representative democracy in its essence came from logistical needs, because you can't possibly be expected to have your say on everything that concerns you, and therefore you elect a single person who goes to the place politics is done and represents you on a whole host of issues. But that kind of inherently brings with it some tribalism, because if you're voting this way on a certain issue, the idea is that you're voting that way on every single issue, and therefore you elect a guy who is like firmly in that camp and only votes in that direction.
Yeah.
In the modern world, issues are a lot more mixed. People have far more diverse and quirky perspectives, but also we're able to have the infrastructure to cater for that. There's an interesting experiment in Taiwan where they have a digital platform which allows them to have, I think, non-binding referenda of the population on a whole host of different topics, and have a political system which takes into account people's views a lot more consistently and constantly. Audrey Tang's work is something really interesting to check out if you're interested in that.
Okay. Send me that after. I might throw them, make sure that's in the show notes.
Absolutely. There's concepts like liquid democracy, which take that even further and play with the idea of like, what if you could have a say on every issue individually, and on issues which you're not an expert, you can delegate your vote to a specific person to make that decision on your behalf. And if you don't like what they're doing, you can then withdraw it. Because again, electoral cycles and having one election every 4 years is partially logistical. How in the 18th century were you meant to get the opinion of the entire population across a huge country any more frequently than that without it being like your full-time thing? Whereas now, in the era of digital communications, you could do that. And well, if you paid enough care to make it secure from foreign interference, which is a whole different kettle of fish. So again, we're looking at a system which was built with certain assumptions in mind, and a lot of those assumptions are no longer relevant. And we don't really take the time to step back and think, hang on, is this really the best way we can achieve? First of all, what are the goals we are trying to achieve? And secondly, is this the best way that we can achieve them, or can we do something more efficient?
Yeah, completely. And from kind of a Bitcoin community, if you will, focus, I've kind of heard three camps. One of the main ones is like a badge of honor. Like, I don't vote. I've never voted. So that's like a badge of honor. I've always thought that was everyone, you're entitled to do that. I don't think people should be required to vote. But that's kind of a weird flex in my opinion.
Yeah. Who was it that said, you may not take an interest in politics, but politics will certainly take an interest in you?
Yes. I forgot who said that, but I've heard that quote many, many times. Absolutely. So there's that. There's more of a, there's so many different people proposing, whether it's city states or going beyond that into democracy doesn't work. So there's that camp as well. Kind of an anarcho-capitalist camp. There's many different factions that have said similar things and view that differently, but whether it's just saying democracy doesn't work, or we need kind of a benevolent king or dictatorship, these type of things, I'm definitely not in that camp. And I think most people listening to this are not in that camp. And then there's kind of closer to what you're saying, which is a more quote unquote, some of the way the US, I think, thinks about it or talks about it in our history classes and things like this, is like a direct democracy approach, like making that as direct and streamlined as possible. So the things that you're talking about, some of the things you've said already, I'm like, yeah, we should just try that. But the amount of people within the system that would make sure that everything you're saying right now does not see the light of day is pretty is pretty overwhelming. But again, throughout history, you could say that in any single movement, oh, this would never happen, and the only way is to go.
I
about
also don't
making
want to
it
be
happen.
idealistic. Like, none of these things is a silver bullet. A lot of these radical ideas that I've mentioned are, have massive drawbacks in themselves, and everything comes with those drawbacks, and it's a matter of balancing and figuring out which ones you're happy with and which ones you're not. If you're someone who wants to work within the system, like, I'd agree with people who say like voting doesn't do much in this day and age, because you have parties which are remarkably aligned on a lot of, especially the way the system works. So where your vote would actually have impact is at a much earlier stage in the selection of the candidate, rather than in voting between the candidates in the actual election. If you get involved in the internal machinery of a political party, that's probably where you can make a lot more impact.
Yeah. One of the things that kind of pulls on the thread of what you were mentioning that I personally am very intrigued in is when there's any sort of in the local states that are considered like ballot questions, and that feels like a very direct democracy movement that also, because on the flip side, in the age of social media, kind of technology, this isn't going to be a conversation about like misinformation and how do we control that or not. But in the age of that, like if you see like everyone votes on everything with the click of a button, right? I can see how that might not end up the greatest. For me, that was kind of the humor of a Trump presidency. And people are like, oh, this would be crazy. This would be nuts. Let's do it. And that's what happened. Now take that onto every single issue. Yeah. But like state ballot questions, for instance, like there could be like a different state initiative, whether it's a lot of the ballot questions that came out were on like marijuana and access to recreational marijuana and decriminalizing marijuana. That was a ballot question where it was a direct democracy, majority wins vote of you had to circle the button yes or no, yay or nay on the sheet.
And again,
type of things are
what
very
the existing system gave was a system in which people are being locked up for nonviolent offenses en masse, in a very racialized way. And when this was actually put to the population, it turns out they didn't agree with the political orthodoxy of the way things had to be and always have been.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and take that on an even local level. So states are already, depending on which state you're in, massive economies. Like California is like the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world just by itself. So that's a massive institution already. But localize that even more into your city, right? And I think there are a lot of people that think that progressive or left means you're for the largest possible government solution, period. And I keep reiterating, perhaps maybe that could be one person's view, but in general, no. What I see from your average everyday left and progressive folks are movements or different value sets that are screaming at the institutions, especially the warmongering institutions, the sexist and racist institutions, these things, and saying we want things to be different. I don't have progressive friends that they're talking about, okay, yes, the government needs to be this massive singular. No, that's not the type of progressive and left movement. So when people think of that, I'm like, I think you're mistaken here. Some people might be into those different things.
Yeah, it's become this stereotype about the left, and in many cases, I think the values which the left stand for would actually be very effectively promoted by a simple change in a single law which protects a certain center of unaccountable power, rather than having to build a huge government apparatus to do something.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, taking that direct democracy approach and then doing state level, localizing it through communities, that would be something that's very, very interesting, but that we're a bit opposed to in the United States in many ways. Do you know of? You mentioned Taiwan. Do you know of any other systems or nations, possibly even in the West or at local levels? I'm not sure what this looks like in the UK as well. Is there any sort of ballot questions like that in the UK in terms of voting? I'm actually curious on that. I don't think I'm
our recent record on that hasn't been great, considering the last referendum was on Brexit.
Yeah, besides that, yeah.
I've heard good things about the Estonian system,
like the Estonian system.
Yeah, which is very heavily digitized and meant to be very easy, but I couldn't tell you many details on that. I've heard the UAE is attempting to, as much criticism as I have for the political system in the UAE, attempting to make government services digitally accessible to everyone, which is obviously something huge. in countries where accessibility is a chronic problem, which I think is every country.
Yeah.
But generally, I think there's been a remarkable lack of, clear thinking about the issue and a lack of will to do things differently. Politicians have been, for the most part, very timid over the last few decades, content with keeping the system chugging along as it already has been in a very technocratic way, rather than really experimenting with new ways of doing things, which is, that's, I guess, my core critique of the left, is that so much of it has become about slogans rather than actually trying new things and building new systems, which is what we're so desperately in need of.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to go back to one of your points that you made about representative democracy, like a couple of hundred years ago. One of the things that also was different is we didn't have lifetime politicians at the time. I mean, our George Washington, our first president, was a very rich aristocrat in one sense of the word, but also was very opposed to, did not want to be king, did not want to be. So we had a lot of people that were in political office that typically didn't want to pursue that in the first place. There was this, it's this weird place of, there were very duty driven people, but they also had slaves. It was this very there were many different things going on in terms of morals, right? It's not as black and white as we pretend that it is in some of these cases. So for different leaders, like they would go into Congress for 2 years and they come back home and work on their farm. It was not this is my lifetime appointment, this is my job. If anything, it was like I'm away from home for 6 months at a time because they had to take horse and buggy and go to DC and represent, right? Do those things. So our system is so completely different than that in so many different ways. Not only do we have the option to hear directly from constituents in light speed, but also people are seeking lifetime appointments. There's money in politics, there's power grabs, all of this. And sure, that has always happened to some degree, but not to this level. So it's almost like we have our system is set up in the worst possible way today. So we need to make adjustments, at least in one area, like removing money and term limits, I think are great practical solutions, but also adding more democracy to our system. One of those things at least needs to start to happen.
Yeah, there was a push a few years ago in the UK for the concept of recall petitions and the ability of constituents to be able to recall a politician. In practice, I think the threshold for that is so high that it's pretty unfeasible,
Sure.
except in the case of massive malfeasance. There have been cases of members of parliament here who basically don't show up to parliament for months and months at a time, and nothing can be done about it. There are members of the House of Lords, which is the upper chamber of our political system, who actually don't show up for years at a time.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's the second largest legislative chamber in the world, I think, after the Chinese one.
Yeah, that's insane. I think we would probably see that here in the States more if people weren't so worried about their careers, because that's kind of political suicide. It's not about, sure, yes, at some early point they could say it's about the constituents, doing it, but my personal view is that there are a small minority of politicians at the real end of the day that is their daily driving motivation. They might think that's theoretically, but then a lot of them you see slowly, they're like, okay, they're vying for power within their party. They're vying for a future position. They're vying for a future, okay, you need to appease to the Speaker of the House because I want to be Speaker of the House, or I want to be in a certain committee and I need to be in this person's good favor to be a part of that committee and this and that. And sure, they might say the end justifies the means, but that's where we get caught up in the US at least, and I'm sure in many other places. So the thought of people doing that in the US, it's not because they're like, oh, we're not being fair to our constituents. The thought is that's political suicide and this is my life. I need to, appeal to these people.
I think one of the ideas that has been lost by the wayside, like the right retains this really strong emphasis on checks on the power of government. But I think one of the ideas that was lost was there was this focus on government because government was the predominant power once upon a time, and now society contains many different powers. And with this obsession of checking the power of government, we've forgotten to check the power of corporations, who are arguably more powerful today than the government, or check the power of the mainstream media. And again, these are ideas that need systematizing more. There's a lot of people who've theorized about them, but I'm not seeing the proposals for new ways of doing them in the modern day.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you've thought much on this. I know we're kind of nerding out a bit politically on political theory, but the thing that for me that Donald Trump really cracked in a lot of ways was any sort of right left, like to suggest that for me a lot his rhetoric is all loose cannon first of all, but his actual policies are very complicated to see where his head's at. It's not a typical Republican Democrat
Yeah, it's the
approach. Like
fracturing of that right left dichotomy.
Sure,
because a lot of his policies were actually quite protectionist.
For sure, and very, very far left isolationist in that regard, or kind of historically what that might look like. But for with Trump, a lot of it kind of broke down. With it, you mentioned checks on government. That's hysterical to me because with the Trump presidency, Trump being the head of the government in a lot of ways. Yes, we have our different branches of government and checks on power in that way, or else he probably would have done even more. And again, for people that might be listening to this so far and they're like, well, the left does this too. Yeah, I understand completely. There are so many power abuses from the left that I will criticize all day and have. But with Trump, the checks on power, like he wanted to just arrest and round up journalists. Like he wanted to destroy his personal enemies using the power of the government. So the fact that the right can ever say at any point post-Trump, because they've decided Trump is their person since he's been in and out of office, Trump has been the head of the Republican Party in the United States. There is no check on government power. Like Trump wants full power. So anyone talking about power and freedom and suggesting that Trump can help usher that in, that's laughable to me. That there is no more check on government power from Republicans. I mean, Republicans used to be the party that, growing up, again, we saw. For me as a kid, it was the Bush presidency. So the power was in military might. That was the in international affairs. That was the Republican Party for a very long time, since probably Bush Senior, and even before that, and obviously Clinton kept that going. But now it's really hard to figure out what that is. But there's abuses of power in both parties. There is no more check on government power. I think both parties in different ways, and you can assess which one is better or worse, are trying to pursue government power in a more totalitarian bent, regardless of the political party. But Trump is absolutely a part of that and helped usher that in so many ways.
And just to underline, like what you're basically saying is the old system isn't working. The functions these parties used to do in terms of checking each other and holding on to like certain values each, that's no longer being done. And that just emphasizes the need for new institutions which organize people around, the sets of values that they want to see embodied in their system. And organizing them so that their voice can be heard and make an impact on the system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one other topic that I wanted to get in with you that you had mentioned as well before coming on and sent over in notes is, a lot of times in the world of Bitcoin, one thing that we focus on and see is, I mean, even outside of Bitcoin is, there's the American Empire, there's the British Empire, there's these things that have been reigning for so long, and we're seeing the breakdown of that, the breakdown of trust in these institutions, the breakdown in trust of the US dollar and global debt. And, some people will say, okay, this is going to collapse tomorrow, Bitcoin standard. I'm not one of those people. I think it will take much longer. These folks are very, very good at kicking the can down the road, right? But the world order has been fracturing for quite some time. And it continues to. We're seeing different factions. We're seeing Chinese-led factions. We're seeing different nation states trying to assemble and combat the power and dominance of the US or the World Bank or all of these other things that you probably focus on a lot. I know Alex Gladstein focuses on a lot. But one other interesting case is, what you sent over about South Africa and their court and the approach that they've taken towards Palestine, towards Gaza, and the human rights abuses and what they're suggesting are violations of different war treaties and freedom accords and things like that Israel has been doing. And yes, we can say that's about a specific instance, but I'm curious. I know South Africa stands in Nelson Mandela for quite some time with Palestine and Gaza, and I've studied abroad in South Africa as well. It's one of my favorite places on earth, and the people there are amazing. For you, I think with this situation, does this strike you as, oh wow, this is very interesting and surprising that they've taken this stance, that they've gone to such lengths to criticize Israel and want to bring about this case against Israel for war crimes? Or do you think this seems par for the course of what they've done in the past, or what nation states might start to do more in the future? Because I think I agree with you. I think it's very, very interesting for them to do this.
I don't think that their criticism of Israel is surprising per se. What I do think is pleasantly surprising is their use of the apparatus of, or their attempt to use the apparatus of international law. What we're going to see now is the definitive word on whether international law is actually worth the paper it's written on or it's not, depending on what happens at the court. But I think what we're basically seeing is the slow shift from a unipolar world to a multipolar one. A stat that illustrates the way the world has radically changed is that in the 1600s, before the beginning of British colonialism in India, India accounted for an estimated 27% of global GDP. At the end of the British Empire, in the middle of the 20th century, it had become 2%. So the West was, there's this idea that the West emerged out of this chain of Enlightenment thought beginning in ancient Greece and, going through the Renaissance, etc., to the Industrial Revolution through to modernity, which I think is a little bit oblivious to the fact that actually the West was built on with looted funds. And the way the world is today, with the inequalities that it contains, is not because the world is inherently this way, it's because it was made to be this way. And we're basically seeing a slow correction and the drifting of countries back towards a more neutral baseline of what they originally were. Part of that system, which is ending, is the fact that certain countries were basically above the law. Especially the US, which doesn't consider itself party to a lot of these conventions on international law, doesn't consider itself to be part of it's not a signatory of the Rome Statute. And Israel, as its client state, is basically protected under that umbrella, completely shielded from accountability, prosecution for crimes committed. And now that the US is no longer, or I wouldn't say no longer, that's an exaggeration, it's less of a hegemonic power with every year because of this shifting of the world order. I think we're going to see attempts to bring more accountability. And I wouldn't by default put my trust in them internally, because there are also attempts to, jockey politically. Like people like Putin and Xi Jinping are attempting to use this as an opportunity to have their own moment of ascendance and impose themselves. So there are, multiple things happening at the same time. But I think people who believe in human rights and believe in these ideals of, human dignity and equality and accountable government can be using this as an opportunity to build a more equal world. And I hope that's what's happening is basically part of a shift in that direction.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you said, that basically a lot of nations and the U.S. and other Western states are starting to get used to states expressing their views or kind of asserting their independence, and this is a shift from the norm in a lot of ways. So it's very interesting. Like some of these, they're not all equal, but some might just be a state expressing their independence and doing as they wish. And then some folks are up in arms about this, which I think is very, very interesting. And it's like, no, it's a return to that pre-whatever era of states feeling more ability to do this. I mean, folks can say that El Salvador has been doing that financially, globally, with the way they've critiqued the IMF, the World Bank, and how they want to, assert their independence in some ways. I know in other ways there's been different affiliations they're kind of tying out, receiving aid from China, other different things, right? And again, I'm not going to get into a analysis of it's not this black and white, good or bad, or whatever. But that state kind of instituting their independence and trying to make decisions for itself, regardless of what the US's views are on that, has been very interesting. It'll be interesting to see, for better or for worse, what course a place like Argentina takes as well. I think the new president there, Javier Milei, he in some ways spoke of a big game on this, but in other ways, you see a lot of handshakes with the World Bank. You see a lot of other things that we'll see. I think kind of similar to Trump. Folks say a lot. We'll see what is done at the end of the day. But I think it's definitely an interesting point in history, and I don't know if we'll be able to put our finger on, okay, this point is what started this. But I think it'll be a few decades of interesting course of action in what I view as kind of the end of an empire and transition to a new world.
And you can see the way that many international institutions are set up is also with the assumption that the world is with a certain configuration of power. An example is the idea of the UN Security Council, and that assumption that this handful of countries are the only countries whose opinion actually matters on global affairs. They are the ones who have a veto, and if they decide something, no one else can say otherwise.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy. You one of the things you said early on in this conversation was, if people can step outside of their assumptions and just try to think for themselves on an issue, like you just saying that on at face value, that's kind of wild to think about. Like that's the way the world has been structured for quite some time. It is.
It's crazy, but we're just so used to seeing it.
Right, exactly. There's so many different things. I love picking your brain on all of this. Is there, obviously you've had a focus on the Middle East and North Africa. Is there a particular place? I mean, you've mentioned a couple in terms of democracy efforts, but in terms of your optimism or hope on the way the world is transitioning and where, is there a particular place or set of ideas or certain movements that you've seen that have been deeply inspirational to you, or possibly the work that your nonprofit is working on? Have there been things that you're really excited about seeing and supporting?
Well, from the bigger picture, I'd say I'm really excited to see the emergence of Africa. The continent has faced so much injustice, so much violence and oppression over the last few centuries, and it may be that this is the century in which Africa truly becomes independent. And I don't mean that in the nominal sense, because a lot of places which gained their independence from open colonialism a few decades ago still suffer under monetary colonialism today. But I think South Africa is part of this movement towards African nations having more assertiveness and a greater say over their own destiny, and I'm really excited to watch that play out. I also think the Middle East has returned to this deceptive stasis, which is what we had pre-2011, where outsiders assume that the situation is stable because not much is happening in many countries which are governed by autocracies, and what's happening in fact is actually deeply unsustainable. But the coming breakage won't be visible until it actually happens, which is what happened in 2011. If you'd polled people at the end of 2010, they would have said, yeah, Egypt is Egypt. Hosni Mubarak has a firm grip on the situation. When he eventually dies, his son's going to inherit and it'll continue as it was before. Little did they know that within mere weeks, the entire country would be turned upside down. And I think that's basically where we are again. And when that happens, there could be some great opportunities for civil society movements to take a more active role if they're ready. And that's basically what my organization works on.
Yeah. Is there, you mentioned financial freedom, because I think, different terms of whether it's slavery or imperial control, like some things for folks studying history are a bit more visible on the surface, right? But I think the era we've entered into since the 50s, even before that, especially with the continent of Africa and the end of imperialism in one form, transition to this monetary imperialism, which we've had Farida on the show to talk about. We've had Alex on the show to talk about. Some of the best, I think, conversations and things to think about, the ways nations are still really having a tough time lifting themselves up and getting moving forward with the will of the people and all of these things. In terms of Bitcoin and thinking about Bitcoin and something that's separate and not controllable by those interests, I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on what do you think Bitcoin fixes and what does Bitcoin not fix? And I guess what's easier is what are the things that Bitcoin can fix, and whatever else is things that that's not really how that would work in your mind. Because some people would like to say Bitcoin fixes everything, right? And I think some people get very protective of Bitcoin as this new monetary technology, feel the need to protect it and protect the narrative around it. But I'm much more interested in seeing what at the end of the day can actually help people, especially these types of conversations.
Yeah, I think humans can fix almost everything, and Bitcoin is a very powerful tool towards that. But I don't think by default it's going to fix much, especially if it continues the path we're going right now, in which I feel like people's focus has turned entirely towards its adoption by large financial institutions rather than the fundamental promise that it offers. So by default, I don't think it's necessarily going to fix anything. But it's going to take a lot of human ingenuity in terms of the application of it to specific problems.
Yeah, and for you, because I'll be honest, I think a lot of it is still quite theoretical. There have been specific use cases and specific instances for human rights activists, for different folks, whether being paid in Bitcoin and able to actually secure this. For certain folks fleeing Ukraine were able to do this, but this wasn't at a massive, large scale. And still isn't. I think globally it has at a pretty good scale, depending on which nation state you're in. But being realistic about this technology is 15 years old. This isn't a globally adopted system yet. Even in El Salvador, it's not. It's nationally adopted from a state perspective, but the amount of folks using it day to day is still fairly low. It's still impressive. It's very impressive for 15 years. I want to be clear about that, and I could not be more supportive. It's one of the few things I have hope for in terms of a tool that humans can use to fight oppressive systems. It's one of the tools that I believe in more than anything, or else I wouldn't be doing this. But for you, are there kind of specific theoretical use cases, well, maybe practical that you've seen, or theoretical use cases that you'd be excited to see Bitcoin as a tool for?
So in terms of the practical, we're very focused on using it to enable people who live in either states with failed economic systems like Lebanon and Libya, where you struggle to do international transactions, or even domestic ones in the case of Libya, or to enable people fleeing conflict, as in Sudan, to be able to do so more safely with their assets. In terms of theoretically, I do think actually that the level of adoption by these use cases does actually pose a challenge to Bitcoiners. We have to think hard about why it is that we haven't seen it catch on more in the places where we expected it to be a slam dunk, and really consider some of the issues that raises, whether that's about fees and chain congestion on Bitcoin itself, or whether that's about the readiness of layer 2 technology like Lightning. There are some questions that we need to ask. I'm not a fan of setting up sacred cows, as you can tell, and we need to be self-critical if we're to actually get anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a huge first step that we're still very, very early on with, is that ability to be self-critical. And for me, a lot of it, whether we're talking about human rights, whether we're talking about environmental impact, and a lot of the resistance from the left, for instance, around Bitcoin, crypto in general, that kind of stuff, is setting the facts straight first, and then we can go on to phase 2, which is criticizing, or kind of having open discussion about what does and doesn't address. What are some of the problems we still need to think within Bitcoin itself, whether philosophically, the technology itself, or scaling and doing different technologies. And the money and support just has not been there in some of the other ways. Like, imagine the amount of money that's being poured into climate research, climate action, and still the fact that we're falling short on that. Right now, imagine Bitcoin, this new monetary technology, facing huge resistance from every powers that be, whether it's on the surface or whether behind the scenes. Um, they kind of see what's going on and are resistant to it. Now, imagine that level of resistance, and the fact that VCs, funding, government funding, all of this stuff, is not necessarily pouring into like Bitcoin only stuff. I think it's doing remarkably well given all of that. But you're right. I think I do worry about to really level up and go to the places where I would love to see it go and really love to see it flourish. Which for me, the U.S. and in a lot of contexts, the West does not need Bitcoin in terms of people are using Venmo, they're using Cash App, they're using these things to transact. They have fairly stable currencies for the time being. All of this, and a lot of people agree with that. Some people, that's not the most popular opinion, but for me, I'm more interested in seeing those use cases that you described. For the folks that really need it, having access to use it, understand it, and it making sense to them, and having technology that works for them. Have you do you think at all about the use of stable coins and things like that? I know that's something that Alex Gladstein and others have talked about the reality of. Like some Bitcoiners won't touch that, but other folks who are seeing it actually in action, saying, "Okay, we've seen this as a use case. We're not saying we're advocating for this or that this is any similarities to Bitcoin, but we're just seeing that people are using it." Is that something that you've thought about at all?
Not in extreme depth, but I do. Yeah, I have found it useful myself. I've experimented with a lot of technologies in the crypto space just in order to understand them and what they enable. And I think stablecoins are probably the killer app there. And I've heard of many experiments on bringing stablecoins to the Bitcoin network. I haven't seen them play out yet. I'm very curious.
Yeah, I don't.
But yeah, I'd also endorse what you said in terms of the real use cases being outside of the West.
Yeah, I think it'll be a very interesting decade for that, and I too am very concerned with. I mean, we've talked about the ETFs a little bit in the U.S. context because, unfortunately, the way of the U.S. at the moment, especially the global financial system, is a lot of times the way of the world. So a lot of people were really anticipating and excited about the spot Bitcoin ETFs because they knew that this could increase obviously a number go up in terms of Bitcoin, but again, the way of the world. Maybe this gives other nations permission to look into it themselves. Hong Kong is trying to, it seems like possibly pursuing a race to do their own spot ETFs in Hong Kong. So unleashing capital. Some people on a positive note have mentioned, oh, this is good. This is more mainstream adoption, lets people understand it. But again, obviously the humor in this is, the whole point of Bitcoin was adopted shortly after, the global recession and great financial crisis of 2008, not needing Wall Street, not needing any intermediary, separate from banks, separate from governments. And then you see a lot of folks getting very excited now that Wall Street is here. Obviously, I see the humor there, and I have many different conflicting views on it. But you mentioned kind of early on, I don't know if there's kind of fear from your end or thinking about that, but do you how do you weigh that in this ecosystem? Or some people have a fear that it's almost co-opting Bitcoin, and we'll kind of see the end of what Bitcoin could be due to this. Others are
I
like,
worry about
this is
that.
good; they can't stop it.
I definitely worry about that. I think about the potential for attempts to fully regulate Bitcoin and de-anonymize it wholesale. I do get the argument of adoption, and that nation state adoption is, ultimately pushing sound money and making the marginalizing debasement. But personally, my concern is for the little guy, not really nation states. So that's where my focus is.
Yeah. Well, getting back to the little guy, kind of one final thing I'll ask is, from your nonprofit, your work, you had mentioned possibly some training institutes coming up, some different things that you're working on. But for you and your organization, the year ahead, what are some things that you're looking towards in terms of your work and things you're focused on, so that I can refer people as well to look into and dig more and support you?
So we're working on a MENA training hub. to onboard human rights organizations, independent media outlets, and activists, and to help them do transactions, receive money internationally, get grants, get contracts, and pay their people outside of the government system so that they can't be surveilled, especially in repressive countries. That's been supported by a grant from HRF, and we're probably going to launch fully in the next couple of months. Aside from that, we're working on a lot of disinformation related stuff, tracking what's happening in the Middle East especially, but also in terms of trying to manipulate external information sources to feed Western audiences with a distorted picture of reality in order to achieve political objectives. That's our Jamal Khashoggi Disinformation Monitor program. And we're also planning to scale up on our media production over the coming months because there's kind of a shortage of sources on the Middle East which actually have skin in the game as opposed to just being pontificating from an ivory tower.
Yeah. What is, besides purchasing the book, which I highly recommend because I think that's the epitome of what you're touching on. It's you being able to speak to a Western audience, but having skin in the game where there's personal ties, family ties, things like that. For our audience, I've been a bit surprised by this. We are roughly like 60% US based and 40% international in terms of audience and listeners. The word progressive is a very US specific word. I'm based in Massachusetts in the US. But a lot of our audience is Western still, but kind of scattered throughout the globe. For our audience, as they think about, we lightly touched on some of these things like Palestine, Israel, different forms of democracy and organization and governments and movements. There's so many different things we could have pulled an entire episode on. For you, what is some really important lessons or things for people to think about when they're looking at conflicts like this and they're thinking, gosh, I don't even know who to trust. I don't even know what to think on this. I know this party says this friend says this. I just don't know where to go and what resources. What would you suggest to them in terms of understanding this, and if folks want to help, what are ways to do so?
Well, I think at the end of the day, you got to listen to your conscience. If something feels wrong, it's probably wrong, even if everyone's telling you otherwise. I think you've got to take in information from a wide variety of sources, especially people who have skin in the game. I keep returning to that concept because people who come from the region, who are materially affected by it, who have family there, are probably less likely to be giving you something that's totally skewed by ideology than complete foreigners. There are the praising social media is not in vogue today, but the greatest thing it gave us is the ability to be directly connected to people all over the world, and that's still how I know about what's happening in so many different places. Build a network, follow people, try to get stuff direct and unfiltered rather than relying on institutional media, and connect that to your struggles back home, I guess. Understand that authoritarianism anywhere is a threat to accountability and justice everywhere. These systems have a way of metastasizing, as you guys in the US saw, obviously with the Trump election. What happened was a whole bunch of global authoritarian forces, whether it be the Gulf monarchies or Putin, had been left to be unaccountable for so long that they started to get brave and spread their influence. And this is all part of a global struggle that we're fighting for human dignity and accountability. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, is there anything else there's a lot of things we didn't cover that we could talk about, but is there anything else that you wanted to make sure, I'd love to have this conversation again with you sometime and pick your brain more on things. But is there anything else that you really wanted to mention, in terms of recent stuff to our audience, anything like that, before we go?
Well, I guess there's a genocide happening right now, so pick up the phone and call your representative, pressure them, make your voice heard. Seems to be the most immediately pressing thing I can say.
Yeah. Awesome. And we'll make sure I'll follow up with you too if there's any resources or things like that you'd like to share. Obviously, your organization and work we'll do the book as well. Encourage folks to get that and read it. Reach out to either one of us as well. Ahmed, what's the best place for people to reach out to you and connect with you?
At the moment, still Twitter until the platform collapses. Twitter, my handle is my surname. You can also find at Kawaakibi for my organization.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for jumping on. Really, really enjoyed this chat and all the work you do. And please let us know how we can support, get the word out, and hopefully we'll see you at upcoming conferences and things like that.
Thank you. See you around.
Awesome.